My name is Linda Zari. I'm a vice president with Apex Bank. I'm primarily focusing on digital infrastructure, and that's notably data centers and fiber to the home networks. It's my great pleasure today to actually chair this panel, where we will discuss catalyzing private sector engagement in digital infrastructure, unveiling opportunities in emerging markets. So understandably, the private sector engagement is key to support the development of digital infrastructure worldwide, and even more so in developing countries. So maybe just before we start, I think let's just have a round of quick introductions from the panelists. I don't know if Adam, you would like to start, and then we'll
Sure. Thanks, Linda.
walk towards me.
Adam Levine, I'm the Chief Commercial Officer at Data4. Data4 is a pan-European data center operator. We have 34 data centers operational around Europe, and we've just hit a gigawatt of available power on our platform. So, you know, very much on the hyperscale side, wholesale hyperscale side of things.
Hello, pleasure to be here. Thank you for the opportunity to join the event. My name is Tanja Tanajama. I come from the European Investment Bank, and I'm heading our digital infrastructure division, where we invest in different types of digital infrastructure sectors, including all the telecom networks, data centers, semiconductors, quantum computing, satellites, and so forth. As you probably not all are very familiar with the European Investment Bank, maybe just a few words about who we are. So we are the EU bank. We are owned by the EU member states. We provide long-term financing for different kinds of investment projects. We have a dual role, so we are a bank, but we are a policy-driven bank. So profit is not our main concern, but we try to maximize the impact on EU citizens and beyond. So we try to do activities that are in line with EU policy priorities. Our annual lending volumes are some 75 billion euros. Most of it is within the EU, 90%, but then we operate in over 160 countries, so we do cover emerging markets as well.
Hello everyone, my name is Rafael Bomini. I am one of the co-founders and CFO at OData. OData is a Latin American data center operator. We are present in 5 countries, Brazil, Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. We now operate 19 campuses in the region with 200 megawatts of IT power contracted and a land bank, power bank with close to 1 gigawatt today.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ahmed Al-Yamani. I am the CEO of Takamul. Takamul is a government company that is in charge of digitizing many of the government services. So we're in the process of switching them from being manual or conventional to being digitized and being smart and being, in some cases, AI-driven as well. That involves a lot of switching of existing data centers and existing data sets from conventional data centers to the cloud. Deals with a lot of hyperscaler services as well. And we recently launched our own venture capital arm as well, which invests in anything related to the above.
Thank you very much for those brief introductions. Maybe before we start talking about the opportunities in those emerging markets and what are the hurdles, let's have a look at the landscape of the digital infrastructure in those emerging markets. And maybe, you know, just for the purpose of our discussions, what we mean by emerging markets are also the hubs which are away, for example, for data centers, the hubs which are developing, which are maybe away from the FLAPD markets. So, yeah. So maybe, Adam, if you would like to start and giving us a bit of a flavor as to what you see out there, any recent developments on those emerging regions from your perspective.
Sure. I think the place to start really is to say that you know, emerging markets, we talk about, you know, obstacles and challenges, but really there's huge opportunities. As we've seen, the historically very overdeveloped data center hubs, London, Frankfurt, Amsterdam, Paris less so, but get extremely inundated with demand. We've seen demand shift and become less geographically specific and less geographically demanding. And as we've seen that, and it was interesting in Hark's opening remarks this morning, that the differences of requirements between the different workloads that are out there. Historically in data centers, all workloads were seen as equal, and so data centers ended up being used as really receptacles for call it the lowest common denominator of workload. And more as these restrictions have crept into these historically core markets, there has been a lot more discrepancy and more discernment amongst the workload, and that workload has been split out, and a lot of that workload has been pushed to emerging markets is probably a little bit, but certainly some of the markets that we're in, Poland, Spain, Italy, certainly a few years ago were emerging markets, and I think that they've fully emerged from their chrysalis state into fully formed markets. But I think the question is that as those markets now start to receive a huge amount of demand and their own growth through subsea cables that are landing stations in Italy, or whether it's from the fact that Poland is the further eastern country where it's a lot of American tech companies feel comfortable placing workload, where are the next emerging markets going to come from? And there are still a lot of opportunities out there for growth, especially on the power side. We heard a lot this morning about how power saturation is really the biggest obstacle to growth in any market right now. So the question is identify where the power is going to be, identify where the political tailwinds are, and there are opportunities out there still for new markets as these historically emerging markets, as I say, they emerge and mature.
Sure, thank you so much. We will develop those points a bit more later as to the hurdles and the opportunities. But maybe Tanya, if I turn to you, I know you've got some activities in Africa and also in parts of Latin America. What do you see there as a current landscape and any recent developments that you're able to share with us?
Yes, thank you. Indeed, as I mentioned, EIB overall is financing investments in all the different parts of the world. However, when it comes to digital infrastructure, traditionally in the past years we've been mainly active in Africa, and there it's been a lot about telecom networks, so really trying to set the basis for connectivity, and there is still a lot of room to go. We have at the moment, for example, the submarine cable project in North Africa. It will be connecting four different North African countries, covering over 7,000 kilometers, 12 landing stations. Then we have several projects, for example, in Mauritania, just building the backbone network, also rollout of 4G and 5G in Uganda. So it's really setting the basis. And if we believe the statistics of ITU, a couple of years ago, what they said was that in emerging markets, or especially in low-income countries, the access to 50% of the population were lacking access to internet. Now it has reduced to 1/3, but especially in terms of then fiber, for example, that is almost inexistent in Africa. So a lot of room to cover. We also see increasing interest now then in other parts of the world, so Latin America and Caribbean. We also have discussions in Central and Southeast Asia. So really building the basis of the whole connectivity and computing digital infrastructure is high on the agenda of all the countries and strategies, and that's also one priority for the EU to support the digitalization ambitions in all the partner countries.
Thank you. Raphael, you're very close to obviously the Latin American market. Would you like to maybe share a different perspective on what type of investments you see there? Who is the most active? What sort of structure maybe,
Yes.
so that we've got a slightly different angle?
Yeah, sure. So we usually tends to see like Latin America as the same thing, and that what happens is that we have countries such as Brazil that's much more advanced on the cloud development. So we have all the hyperscalers present there, and on the other side we have like Colombia that announced like this year the first hyperscaler entering the market. So it's a wide spectrum in LATAM. What we are seeing right now, which is quite interesting to share, is that since we have all the power constraints in the US, what we are seeing right now is that part of the demand that we are seeing, that huge demand related to AI in the US, shifting to LATAM as being like a solution for what's happening there. And that's something that we foresee that will continue in the coming years, because the challenge that we are facing right now in the US, it's not like, will not disappear in the next 3 to 5 years. So it's something that we should see in the next years more and more.
Thank you. And then maybe turning to the Middle East, there's a lot of hype about it. There is a huge boom expected there. I know that there was an event held recently, where they showcased, for example, that how the industry is getting a bit more organized. There's a local data center association now. There's a lot happening. Could you maybe show with us some of the key developments you've been able to see in your region?
Sure. There are a lot of changes in the recent years, and these changes will only continue to grow over the coming 5 to 10 years, or at least expected to. The first major change that will drive a lot of demand for digital infrastructure are the mega projects, or the giga projects that you probably hear about in the Middle East. There are cities that are being built from scratch to be gaming cities, or sports cities, or esports cities. The investment commitment is there, and the construction has started. There are regions that are being converted into the new Maldives of the world in the Red Sea. There is a complete development in the Red Sea that will probably grow to become, within the coming 5 to 10 years, 5% to 10% of all of the hotel rooms that you see in London. There is also the NEOM development, which is the city of the future. You must have heard about it one way or another. And all of these projects are creating substantial demand for digital services, not only because building cities from scratch will require that, but also because these cities are either looking into e-gaming or esports or smart security or AI development. So the amount of demand that this will generate is substantial. There are talks, of course, about things being stretched in terms of timelines. Instead of finishing 2030, they're looking at 2035, 2040. But no matter what you say about that stretching, the fact is 60% of the construction in the Middle East is happening in Saudi Arabia. So this is a reality, that construction is taking place, and that determines one component of the demand I'm talking about and we're seeing. The other component is the digitization of everything in the country. There is both the public sector and the private sector are moving towards digitizing everything they do. A few years ago, many of our government services were provided conventionally. Today, most if not all of them are provided digitally. To give you a simple example, everything in the labor market regulation and government service provisioning is today streamlined and automated, and it's about 1 million transactions on this sector only every day. And that's a lot of transition from conventional to digital infrastructure. That digital infrastructure started in simple data centers, and now it's switching to being cloud-based, and it's switching to hyperscalers. What this has done is that it has driven demand on cloud services to have reached today between $4 and $5 billion a year. That's cloud services being sold in the country. And given all of the transformations I've just described, we're looking at doubling this within the coming 4 to 5 years. So we're looking at between $8 and $9 billion of investments in cloud services within the coming 4 to 5 years because of all of the above. And what that has done is that it has driven hyperscalers. I'm talking Oracle first, followed by Microsoft, followed by Alibaba, followed by Google, and 2 months ago by Amazon, AWS, to announce an investment of $10 billion within Saudi Arabia in building and delivering their services. That's going to demand a substantial amount of digital infrastructure services, and that will drive a lot. And that's what we need to focus on in terms of what are the hurdles and what will stop these businesses from being able to provide their services in such a booming ecosystem.
No, that's quite impressive growth ahead of us, fueled by this huge demand. And as we touched upon earlier on between ourselves, you've got this, on one hand, that's huge demand. On the other hand, some capital which is generally available. So what would make it that there would be more private sector engagement in those emerging markets? What would be the opportunities for them and the hurdles? So I know, Adam, you touched on a couple of things earlier in relation to the power. Would that be one of the hurdles, the key hurdle?
Yeah, I think it's interesting that that both Raphael mentioned that there is a big push to Latin America from North America by power constraints. Exactly what we're seeing in Europe as well. A lot of the demand in Southern Europe initially was driven by that, just by by dint of the necessity to go seek power, right? And I think you're going to see the same in the Middle East as well. It's interesting that you're saying 60% of the construction is in Saudi Arabia. So if you fast forward 4 or 5 years, you're going to see I'm assuming at some point your infrastructure is going to be saturated, and that you're going to start seeing that workload shift elsewhere as well. So there's going to be opportunities, I'm assuming, outside of Saudi Arabia. If you just extrapolate from our own experiences here in Europe. And so, capital, whilst not limitless, there is a lot of private capital out there. So there is no real lack of funds, whether it be equity or debt, to go build new facilities, new data centers, new digital infrastructure in general, especially in our region, in EMEA. It's a politically stable, safe zone to invest. But what we're seeing more and more is that the bottleneck, the main obstacle to growth in these areas is power. And power is heavily regulated and heavily invested in by the government, right? And governments, as we know historically, do not build infrastructure projects very well, or certainly not very efficiently. And so I think the big question that we need to be asking ourselves, and certainly Data4, as I don't know if you're all aware, but we're 100% owned by Brookfield, and Brookfield is very much an infrastructure fund with strong investments in the power sector and notably the renewable sector. And I think that's where we're looking at opportunities now where we can grow, and I think that's where anybody in this room that's looking for opportunities to grow in emerging markets, I think it's the first thing you have to say is the infrastructure there to support? Power is the first one, but then you've mentioned it as well. Is it, there's the skilled labor, engineering sector, is it there? Is there an ecosystem to support the growth around it? But fundamentally, the first problem that we have today, or the first challenge that we all have to overcome in any emerging market, is the power and the infrastructure. And I look to the Middle East and say, if you know that in 4 or 5 years Saudi Arabia is going to have those issues and there's going to be growth elsewhere, there's going to be opportunities outside of there in the same way that Raphael experienced it in Latin America and that we experienced it in Madrid, Milan, even Warsaw to a certain extent. We saw these opportunities coming because these markets, the other markets, the Londons, the Amsterdams, the Frankfurts, did not get out ahead of the curve and build the infrastructure to support the coming growth.
Thank you. Tanya, you mentioned earlier that the EIB is very much driven by policy. Would you say that there are maybe other hurdles beside power that you would identify as being difficult to overcome for potential investors?
Indeed, if we now especially focus on Africa, where our digital infrastructure projects tend to be, it's of course then sort of more unstable and less developed environment than what you are referring to, and there we often have skills and competencies is of course a major issue. So if we work both in the private sector and as well as with public sector clients. In the private sector, if we work with multinational operators, they of course know what they are doing, but then we try and support also more local players, and they may need support. And then it's an issue in the public sector starting from the beginning. So digital infrastructure, it's not an end in itself. It's a facilitating, it's become really a critical infrastructure that we need, but it's supposed to enable the things that we expect in relation to digital transformation. So in the public sector, when you start thinking about them building your digital infrastructure bases, it's good to start with some sort of a digital agenda or strategy and plan the whole journey and what are the infrastructure needs and for what are the needs. And often it starts at this level that we try and help with the building of sort of robust strategies and then drill it down to the concrete investments. And then there is a need, of course, to support then the projects as such. And something that we do provide to achieve this is that together with the European Commission, we provide different technical assistance and advisory services, both to public sector and private sector players. And that's also one way how we can also then crowd in private sector financiers. So we were talking about stimulating more participation from private sector, and we see one of our roles as an international financial institution is to really try and stimulate private sector and facilitate private sector financiers to join our projects. Especially in Africa, the environment tends to be quite risky, but for example, with the technical assistance and advisory support, we can try and improve the quality of the projects and that way reassure private investors. Also, our due diligence that we do is very thorough and robust, and it covers all the different elements, and it's often perceived as a good signal for private investors that it reassures them of the quality of the project. In terms of then catalyzing private sector further, what we also do a lot in Africa is that we partner with financial intermediaries. So we provide credit lines to banks so that they can then on-lend it to certain targeted activities in line with our policy priorities, or then we invest in different equity funds alongside with other investors. And listening to the discussion already here today, I start to get the mismatch between supply and demand. On the other hand, maybe there is all the funds available, but how to sort of connect the dots. So I'm also thinking in terms of the emerging markets that maybe now is the time, especially in the case of digital infrastructure, to also start thinking about how we bring all this together. Can we design, for example, some new innovative financing mechanism combining our financing, maybe other public sources, private sector financing to facilitate then all these investments and try and find solutions and fill the gaps.
Sure, because of course, if that idea was kind of put together, then that would bring lots of opportunities, and maybe that's something we can explore. So, what sort of opportunities would you see for the private sector, for example, in the LATAM region, Rafael?
So, if we see the hurdles in LATAM similar to what I mentioned before, so you need to go country by country. So maybe in Colombia, the challenge there is you need to be within a free trade zone. Without that, you are out of business. In the case of Mexico, power is still a constraint. In the case of Brazil, okay, we have a lot of power generation. However, the distribution is not there. You need to build that. In the case of Chile, you have a very thorough environmental process in order to license your project. So I believe the challenge here is really to structure local teams that are able to understand that reality and tackle those challenges, and it's really like turn those challenges in barriers of entry for other players. So that's what we see. So obviously it's the same here in Europe. So Adam mentioned, so it's really hard to get power. However, they have like 1 gigawatt of power, and for sure that right now it's a huge opportunity for someone in Europe with that amount of power, and the same applies for LATAM, the same applies for Align, that's our shareholder in the US. So if you have the power in that very constrained market, you can like have really good negotiations with your customers, right? So it's really, and when you have that project that's really well structured, I agree there is like plenty capital available to come in and help to develop those projects. So it's really a matter of like structuring those projects that make the difference. So even in LATAM, we have plenty private capital available for those products.
So would you see, Ahmed, a similar, would you agree with what has been said for your region as well? Or
It's quite
is
different.
that a split?
Yeah,
a
it's
different
actually,
picture?
yeah, it's a different picture because of two things. One, power is not a major challenge. One, because of the commitment of the government to supply power. And this is both forms, conventional and renewable. We have 17 projects in the country running today, targeting to deliver 13 point something gig for the entire infrastructure, not necessarily, not only digital, but this digital is going to probably consume a small percentage of that. So we don't see power as a major problem simply because of the commitment of the government, plus the less relaxed or the more relaxed requirements on PUEs, etc. for the time being. They may get different in the future, but at least for the time being, they're more relaxed. The issue is, if you want to know the hurdles, it's two things. One, access to talent, the skilled workforce that will actually build and operate this infrastructure. Two, putting all the pieces together in terms of the supply chain and the contractors and the companies that will build and deliver these services. These are significant issues, and I think they're quite common. If you look at the two ends of the spectrum, the end of the processing power, whether if it's for any purpose, including AI or cloud services or whatsoever, which has been growing over time substantially. Michael Moore, Moore, the founder of Intel, in 1965 said, we will double our transistor, number of transistors within the same chip every year for the coming 10 years. So he expected this to stop at 1975. It's continuing until today. Until today, we're doubling the number of transistors, not within every 12 months, but within every 18 months. And the trajectory hasn't stopped for the last 60 years and is projected to continue. That too much processing from one end has not been met by sufficient buildup of digital infrastructure to consume it or to avail that power to the end user. In the middle of it, there are the companies that took advantage of this processing power, either by building more powerful processors, consuming that processing, whether for storage or artificial intelligence or anything else. But there hasn't been the translation of that into available infrastructure for end users at the same speed. And we heard today in the opening speech that we've been going 10x every 10 years in terms of data center infrastructure. This needs to increase more and grow more. And the only way to it is to modularize the development of that infrastructure. We're not yet there. For this to be able to scale at the necessary need, whether if it's in the Middle East or any other region, what needs to happen is much, much more modularization of how we deliver, how we develop, how we deliver, and how we operate this infrastructure. Until today, it's far more custom than it should be, far more customized than it should become. But in short, it's basically competence, whether if it's companies or individuals who can do that. And that competence is very scarce today. It's spread thin all over the world to provide the necessary services.
But that's the point I was actually gonna highlight, because we've heard it a couple of times now, and I'm just wondering, are there any initiatives out there? What is being done in the regions where that talent, where that capacity, in terms of experience for the design, for the build, for the operation, what is being done? Are you seeing any particular initiatives to develop and to bring that expertise to the market? I don't know who would like to maybe comment.
There are initiatives on this in the country. When every company, every hyperscaler that comes in and wants to do their work, they typically come with training programs and allocation of thousands of people, sometimes tens of thousands of people that they will train to use and operate their services. But this still has not translated to the lower level of the digital infrastructure itself. This, I haven't seen it sufficiently in the region, probably because of the absence of the very specialized operators. I mean, if you look at data centers in the region, they've been built for a long time by telco operators, and then a little bit by real estate developers, energy companies. We still don't have the specialized data center operators that will look at this as a specialization, and there isn't enough of them in the world. When they exist at the right capacity and at the right scalability and ability to expand in terms of training and modularity, we'll see an accelerated growth. For now, that's a hurdle.
Okay, but can I ask you your views as well as to whether in new regions you see specific initiatives different to the hyperscalers?
It's a similar challenge. So what happens so it's a very nascent industry in a region. So you don't have like data center experts, and you really need to develop from like neighbor industries. So in the case of data center, we do see a lot of experience like with people that build hospitals, build airports that are like mission critical facilities. So what we are doing is like attracting a lot of those talents and like adapting them for the data center industry. So that's basically what's being made in LATAM. So
And who's championing this? Who's championing the transfer of that skills from one sector to the next?
So usually the operators are doing that. So it's much more our team that's more like data center trained, like working with the GCs and adapting them for what's needed in the data center industry. So
Okay, no, thank you for sharing that. Adam, I feel that you want to make some comments, or am I mistaken?
Listen, I'll always make comments, you know. I've got plenty to say. No, I think we've identified here like the three main obstacles, right? Are power, and I'll put them in what I think are order of importance: power, supply chain, and skills. And I think what we've seen time after time in not just emerging markets but developed markets as well, is that the digital requirements that are driving the infrastructure needs are accelerating with such pace. We never get out ahead of the curve, right? And every time you see a government or a public body coming out and announcing an initiative, whether it's on building new substations, whether it's on driving new skills, or supply chain tends to be more of a global thing. You always feel that they're reacting and that they're behind the curve, and I don't really see that changing until demand slows down a bit, because you can't reset, right? So there's always going to be this reactivity, and I think it comes down to really how do you bridge that private sector and public sector gap in terms of the private sector need to invest and to grow and to always be growing at scale and to be getting the IRRs and the returns on investment, and the public sector always needing to regulate and invest and take its time to develop. And I do believe that probably the best tool for bridging that are the data center associations, in each region. So France Data Centers or Tech UK. I'm sure you have something similar, and we have EUDCA as well, of which we are a board member, run by Michael Winterson. And I do believe that is the way forward, in that these are the guys that we all need to be, I think, probably as private sector investors and developers of data centers and just technical infrastructure in general. We're not as proactive as we should be in communicating to both municipal, federal or central governments, and then European government or whatever regional government that you have. We are not sufficiently proactive in communicating through our local or regional data center association, and I think they're a tool that should be used a lot more for bridging that gap. Otherwise, we're going to keep repeating these same cycles of demand getting out ahead of supply, everybody playing catch up, everybody reacting, and really you're just sticking a band-aid on the problem.
I think it's a very interesting takeaway, actually. But I'm just conscious of the time now. Have we got time for some questions, or? Okay, so if anyone would like to pose a question to the panel, we're open to it.
We're between people and their lunch.
I know, I realize. I can smell the food as well. But yeah, no, I think the point on the data center association is a very good one. I think some of them are probably a little bit more active than others, especially when in Germany. I'll give that example because they try to manage the public perception of data centers. And you're right, being all the stakeholders being members of that association can certainly do a lot more to help maybe train, bring up to speed, share the, maybe have campaigns, maybe in colleges, and just to help develop the whole digital infrastructure sector.
Indeed, if I just may, and I think it was a very good point on the gap between public sector and private sector, capacity and knowledge. And if we think about the digital infrastructure moving forward, so what I said earlier, it's already a critical infrastructure, but in the future it will be the basis of almost every aspect of our life. And that means that it will need to be regulated. And we heard during the last session, it's a lot about AI, cybersecurity, data protection. We talk about quantum technologies. All these are highly complex technologies. It's not easy to grasp, and they are evolving very fast. We heard about during last session that it's not about months or years, it's about days and weeks. So it's really important to try and bridge the gap and at the same time help everybody to maintain with the speed of technology development.
Yeah. Okay, let's hope that maybe in a year's time we'll be further advanced with that talent. Maybe on these notes we're going to conclude. Thank you so much to the panel for sharing their insights and their views and for the lively discussions.
Thank you, Linda.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.